right, welcome to Your Time, Your Money, the show where your time is just as valuable as your money. We thank you so much for tuning in today. Special treat, we have a guest star, I guess you would say. That's right, guest star today. My brother, actually, Michael Esslie. So we're going to cover quite a few different topics today. But welcome to the show. Today's topic is closing on real estate. Obviously, everybody goes through some type of transaction with real estate, whether it's through retirement, whether it's first home or whatever. So we wanted to bring in somebody that specialized in closing so our clients could understand a little bit more in detail about the problems associated with it, maybe some of the hang-ups, things that slow it down as well, and why it's important to work with a professional as well. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Adam, I know next week we also have a kind of piggyback to this as a real estate agent as well.
Yep.
So some timely topics for clients. Just give you a little background of Mike. He was a graduate of Albany Law School in 1998. Graduate from Albany Law School, resides in Cairo, New York, so down in Greene County, but does closings throughout Greene, Columbia, Albany, Ulster, all over the place. So with an addition to that, does a lot of pro bono activities. I know very involved in soccer with the Northern Catskill Soccer Association, the Youth Association early on. I believe just got offered the position coaching at Columbia Greene.
Correct.
Right? For women's soccer. And your daughter, my niece, started a semi-pro soccer league in Cantine Field down in Saugerties, New York. So a lot in the soccer world there as well to closing. So with that being said, let's dive into it a little bit and get into the questions that we find all the time that clients ask from us. So you want to do the honors?
Sure.
Your time?
Your money.
All right, great. They didn't break it this time, like
No, I didn't flip it.
So I think the first process, first is understanding the process of closing and what closing is, because a lot of people, let's talk about from the kind of new homeowner standpoint. They've never been involved in that experience, and we've talked about this on multiple episodes, that anytime you do something for the first time, you're never an expert, right. Which is one of the reasons why people go with a financial advisor, because we've seen a lot of situations all the time, but also why somebody should look for a specialist when it comes to real estate closing. So, Mike, you want to give a little insight into the process of closing, what it is, kind of what people should expect going into the closing?
Sure. Well, basically, first step is locating a home, finding that right home, one that fits your needs, and usually you're dealing with a real estate agent, and the real estate agent generates an initial document, one of two different types of documents. They either generate a binder, which is like a 1 or a 2-page form, essentially just sets forth some of the broad strokes, the terms of the contract as to what you expect between the parties, or they set forth a 5-page form, which is an MLS, a multiple listing contract that realtors have available to them. It says insert the blanks, I guess you would say. Mm-hmm. They just kind of write in different things like who the buyer, who the seller is, purchase price, are they doing inspections, and things along those lines. That's your very first step. So as long as you can get a meeting of the minds on the purchase price and some of the vague terms that are involved, it gets passed off to me or some other attorney who does closings. We communicate with the seller or the buyer's attorney, depending on which side would table on. Generally, on a lot of instances, that initial contract, if it's a 5-page document, the MLS version, it's acceptable generally to the sellers, not so much to the purchasers. So I would say that's one of the big distinctions that people should be watching out for. So if one of your clients or a client is a seller, there may be a little bit more of an easier process or a smoother process to start off when you're generating the contract. If you're a buyer, you really need to reach out to an attorney at the earliest point possible after you find the property to kind of go through that contract, make sure you understand what you're signing, make sure that it's set up the way you think it should be set up. And what I generally do with clients is I usually talk to them on the phone, most likely now, not so much meetings after COVID and such. But generally what I'll do is I'll interview them for like 20, 30 minutes, and we'll kind of go through like different aspects of what the house, may have in it. Like has there been any additions to the house? Is there any improvements in the basement? Is it access on a public road? Different things like that. I don't know if that's what you're kind of looking for a description of the process.
Yeah, so, from what I'm understanding from you, so the clients and listeners can understand, is, we're getting a general outline of the procedure. And that's going to identify the buying agent, the selling agent, the bank that you're working with, the different attorneys on there, as well as the semblance of the property. right? So you're identifying all the players, so to speak.
I was thinking about the idea that, when someone gets an idea in their head of whether it's I need to I got to get my retirement going, or I got to buy a house. A lot of it is people just don't know what they don't know. And that's why you rely on the experts in your community to help guide this. And a lot of people, when they start the home buying process, don't really know all of the aspects of what goes into it,
Yeah, and to delve even in the more simplistic terms, so after this outline is formulated and the parties are identified, then what you're doing is you're going in there as an attorney and you're trying to figure out what's the details of the property.
Correct.
What's been done, what renovations, what brings value to it.
Yeah, we're trying to identify issues that may pop up at a later date. So when I interview a client and let's say it's vacant land or something similar to that they're purchasing in this instance, is this vacant land in a floodplain? That would be something that would pop up. It's more imperative that I know that answer for a house because every lender under the planet is doing a search to see if something's in a floodplain,
right.
And then they would require flood insurance off of that. So when I'm asking those questions, like do you have a finished basement? A lot of times we're finding that in finished basement situations that the homeowner has decided that they don't want to pay taxes on that living space, so they've renovated the property without necessarily notifying the town or obtaining proper permits. Those are things that I need to watch out for, that I need to kind of know up front.
Yeah, so that's a key point that I think the listeners really need to understand, because it's not just, I think finished basement is probably one of the most common that you run into, but it could be, correct me if I'm wrong, an addition on a home. Might be maybe a shed that was outside of the scope of size that maybe the town requires. So knowing the nuances of what a town provides, I think, would be most valuable, right?
Yeah. I see it too where people add a bedroom. A lot of times realtors take listings and they see a bed when they go walk through the house and they immediately list it as a bedroom, but,
right.
it can't technically be a bedroom without a closet. So if it's just a room that they put a bed in and they've marketed it as a 4-bedroom house and it's only approved to the town with 3 bedrooms,
yep.
Those are the issues that every attorney should be kind of identifying up front because...
Yeah, I was going to say, no, just out of curiosity, in that particular situation, is there an age of a home? Because, obviously, some of the older homes aren't going to have the closets in there, but they were built in the 1800s or something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because one of the things you learn over a bunch of time, doing a bunch of closings is when you ask for the age of the house, you can pretty much tell what is going on with that house. Like if you tell me it's a 1900s, 1910, 1920 house, I don't know how much detail you want to get into, but I would tell you that watch out for your well and septics because the sanitary codes back then were not what they are now.
Sure.
So generally those wells and septics are too close to each other. And since they're too close to each other, a lot of lenders won't lend on them. But that's all good stuff that you need to know.
Sure.
So when I'm interviewing a client, that's why it takes 20, 30 minutes, is I want to know what type of loan are they getting? Are they getting an FHA loan, which has an inspector or appraiser go out there who does a quasi-inspection of the property and is going to come back and tell me that I have a well in the basement, which they won't lend on, or that their well and the septic are too close and they won't lend. And then what I'm trying to do is get them to readjust their thought process that maybe they can't do the FHA. Maybe they need to go to a conventional lender like a brick and mortar bank that isn't necessarily looking for those things or identifying those types of things as being issues for funding.
Yeah, so 30,000 foot level for our listeners is you really need to have somebody that knows all the nuances, right? And it sounds to me like, there's a lot that just the average attorney that doesn't deal with real estate all the time may miss. And, and then what happens? Then it comes back from the lender saying, well, we need this in addition, right? And then there's always wait time with an attorney usually on that. And then something else comes up and then there's wait time there.
You say prolonging the process.
I mean, what's the longest you've seen a closing go?
A year.
Okay. All right. I'm sure that wasn't in the cards for the purchaser or the seller.
Right. Yep.
I just closed one last week that started in August.
Okay.
So and I'm closing one today that started in October.
Okay.
Just to give you an idea.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of the rules have changed, obviously around regulations on lead-based paint and asbestos and all the things that, to your point, Adam, were in homes,
right?
Back in the 1800s or even early 1900s that necessarily weren't there.
Yeah. And one of the significant transitions with the way the market is with post-COVID, so to speak, because I don't know if everyone's aware, but when COVID lifted, kind of like when they started allowing showings of houses near the end of May, beginning of June in 2020, at least in my area, which is perfectly suited about 2.5 hours from the city in Long Island, everybody was waiting to get out. Everybody wanted to leave.
Yeah.
And it created a massive real estate boom, like down by me. It's still going on, coupled with the fact that Greene County has 2 ski resorts. It just kind of went through the roof, and it just created like volume, like
Right.
you couldn't even imagine the volume, and it's still coming through the system.
So could you speak maybe a little bit on some of the relationships that you find you've built up over the years that are beneficial that clients or listeners, should disseminate when they're looking at an attorney? Do they have relationships perhaps with a title person or other industries?
Yeah, well, basically, the way it works is, attorneys either have their own title agency, which isn't as common as it used to be, because after the crash in 2008, the title companies restricted the number of agents and they drew back their licenses or agencies or whatever you want to call it. So we generally just go outside to third-party title agents. Like, I don't know if I can mention names of title agencies that I deal with, but we generally go outside to third parties and we just consistently work with them. And by working with the same people over and over, I'm sure it's the same with financial stuff, but by working with the same people over and over, you get a good relationship, because if you come up against a weird issue, there's a easier way to find a solution through it.
Yeah, and to your point, my wife and I ran into that issue when we built our home. Is we had a neighbor that had built their shed on our corner of our property, and the title company didn't want to necessarily close, but because of the relationship that you had with them, they were able to write a title excluding that 2-foot section of the property and be able to move through with the closing.
2 feet.
Yeah. 2 feet we never use, but still at the same time, the most important 2 feet.
Right. Exactly.
That's the kind of nuance things that come from having those relationships. Is like you're able to call up the owner of the company and you're able to say, look, this is what's occurring. This 2 foot doesn't impact the overall value of the property. Can you issue a policy that would ensure on the lender's side a clean policy for them at the time of closing?
Yeah. Again, just echoing the whole idea of a team. When you've got a team that a person is working with, they can rely on that team to get things done in these types of situations.
Yeah, and you need a team.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's here or any other type of field, you definitely need people that you can rely on.
Yeah.
Do you find that there's been more pushback from lenders through COVID, or do you find it's been the same kind of response from lenders as far as process and requirements and stuff like that? Are they taking any extra steps?
Well, there's been this gradual, I want to say like lessening of requirements with lenders. Lending has freed up tremendously. So like it started off years ago, before everything kind of adjusted with the real estate market. It started off, you had to have a certain credit score, and if you didn't have that credit score, you had debt to income ratios and things like that. That's eased up. I mean, even the requirements for down payments have eased up tremendously. And with the government coming in and basically making these FHA loans and then having the PMI insurance, mortgage insurance for things that are financed at a certain level, it's reached a point where, they've kind of lowered their standards to lend, and it's making homes more available to people, credit more available to people, which is further driving the price up, because people can now go in and get a loan that they didn't think they could get initially. Right. And that's driving the price up. It's corresponding, and then it becomes a feeding frenzy, because you have all the people that are outside the area who are trying to move to this particular area, a little bit south of Albany in particular. Yep. And they're just driving the price up because the inventory is so low.
Can you maybe speak a little bit on that process? So you engage in the contract itself. You make the offer. There's a little negotiation back and forth, and the seller says, "Hey, I'm going to agree to that offer." Right. Then the next step, moves towards an inspection. And what are maybe some problems you see with the inspections that come through? And then what in that process delays it, or can people do to avoid the delay or shorten a delay?
Well, one of the biggest transitions, and this was kind of going on a number of years ago, is technically the proper way to do it is, okay, let's go from the binder to the contractor, or use the contract and put a rider. And a rider is basically additional terms that you throw into a contract to kind of provide some protection that generic MLS contract is missing. So we used to wait until the contract was signed, the rider was signed, and then do the inspections. Now the market, the way it is kind of driven us away from that, whereas majority of sellers realize they have a little bit more power. So they're coming back and you're saying, do your inspections now. I want to know that you're going to buy this house, and provided that funding's there, but I don't want you to cancel or have any reason not to go forward based on whatever the inspections may result in. So a lot of people are doing pre-inspections, which is a little bit risky because you're spending $700, $800 depending on the number of tests you're doing, and you don't really have the seller locked into the contract. Now, a lot of people, like sellers and buyers, don't understand that concept. So like the seller thinks, hey, I signed something, I'm locked in. And the buyer's like, yeah, I got them locked in. So they feel kind of comfortable doing that. But that's been the biggest transition with inspections, is that they're being done even before there's an actual written contract that's in place or a valid contract that's in place, because the sellers want to know that that's not going to be a contingency. And a contingency in a contract for a seller is a bad thing. It's a good thing for a purchaser, because it puts the purchaser in a position where if something happens and it's adverse or it's negative, they can cancel. They can get out. They can get their deposit back.
Or negotiate a lower price.
They can negotiate a lower price. Yeah, they have a bunch of different options there to be able to do that. But it's going back to your original question about the inspections. I mean, some of the things you find, obviously you can find asbestos, you can find mold, which is a big thing. You can find radon, if you do a radon test and things along those lines. As for just a generic house inspection, I mean, if there's obviously a leak in the roof or something like that. But those are all things that I highly recommend that any buyer, if we're talking about buyers, be at the inspection and actually be there the entire time. Because if you're not at the inspection, when you read that report at a later date, you're going to consider that whatever the inspector says to be the gospel, and it's going to be sinister in your mind, because you're going to look at that and you're going to say, well, he says there's a potential leak in the roof, whereas he might have, if you were there, said, oh, it looks a little aged. It looks like maybe they did a repair here and maybe this was just here.
Yeah, so for our listeners and clients, just imagine that. You're making the biggest purchase of your life, and you're making a decision to buy a property. And in the mind of a purchaser, you want that perfect. Even if it's a 80-year-old house, you want that perfect. You don't want to see like all these things on there. And maybe you're prepared to do some work, renovation work, new kitchen, new bathroom, or something like that. But the inspector is going to put it on there because, right, legally he has to. You're hiring that person to point out all the flaws. It's like, imagine going to date your wife, and then somebody just came with a list of all the flaws before you went on the first date. You know what I mean? And so you're going out to buy that home, but you're getting this report that, like to Mike's point, if you're not there and you didn't understand what he was saying, he might have said, oh, there was a crack in this one thing, and or whatever, and it ends up being a paragraph or two paragraphs in the inspection statement, and now you're reading it and saying, oh my goodness, do I want to buy this property?
And it's a scary thing because like you said, it's your biggest purchase most likely in your entire life. You're just going to read something negative right off the bat because you're kind of like, uh-oh, and maybe you already have an opinion as to whether or not you're paying too much, and then you read it even worse as a wart on the house, so to speak. So yeah, that's like a little nuanced thing that that like I don't think a lot of people say, but you should definitely go to your inspection. That inspector is there. You're paying him. You can ask him any questions that you want. So it's bad. It beats calling them up and try to track them down afterwards because they get busy and they don't always get back to you like immediately because they're just so swamped with things. But like a nuance for the seller is like, don't go to the walkthrough. Because all you can get is questions that you shouldn't be answering, because the walkthrough means that you're so close to closing that all you can really do is say something that's not advantageous to your position of trying to sell the house. So don't go to the walkthrough. I mean, there's different things like that need to be kind of relayed. Now,
so buyer go through the walkthrough, seller don't.
Well, buyer always has to go to walkthrough, yes. Yeah, buyer wants to make sure that the house, and a walkthrough, just for everybody who's listening, a walkthrough realistically is your final chance to look at the house to make sure that nothing occurred condition-wise or something to the house.
All the copper was ripped out of the walls.
Yeah. Between the day that you last saw
it. The local high school had a frat party there the night before.
Right.
Yeah,
hey, this house is empty.
Exactly. But that gives you the last chance to look at it before you actually sit down and pay your money over to the seller. And you can find issues, that you should test the heat, you should test, the water, turn on all the water, test it all. Test the AC if you can, if it's not in the middle of the winter.
So there could be a potential lengthy delay in the closing because of all the nuances of that inspection. From the seller's standpoint, I think about a property that I sold, years ago, where the inspection came back and the buyer saw the inspection list and there was like 5 or 6 things on there, but I took it upon myself literally to get it all fixed within a couple days because we wanted to go right back to the buyer and say, boom, done.
All done. Yeah.
Because it does 2 things, right? It removes buyer's remorse and it, puts the property where it needs to be able to be, sold effectively.
Yep.
And if you delay on that, then obviously weeks could go by, especially if you can't do the work yourself or you're hiring contractors to come in to repair stuff. I mean, I don't know about you, but have you ever hired a contractor and it's been timely? Well, I know because you just did your kitchen over, so I know your experience with contractors hasn't been.
It worked out in the end, but that's exactly right. I was thinking about, we bought our house 14 years ago this upcoming May, and when we purchased it, it was kind of this scenario where the people that were in there had to move because they were already moving to California, and people that wanted to buy our house that we were in wanted to get right in. So we were trying to really shoot for a 30-day window to actually get through everything, get through the inspection, and it was only a 5-year-old house. So we're like, oh, it shouldn't be a problem. And what happened for us is that we closed 31 days. So it's pretty good. But what they found during the inspection was that the radon level was a little, like a smidge high. So we ended up having to negotiate getting
system.
Yeah, system put in. But what's it called? It's like basically a reduction in the cost in order to pay.
You took a credit to do the work after the closing.
Yes.
And and if you don't mind me interjecting, depending on which side of the table that is appealing and not appealing.
Right.
Because one of the risks, just to point out to people that are listening, is that if you're a seller, that's great because you get a credit, you're locked in, and no matter how much it costs after the fact to resolve the problem, you paid a certain amount.
Yeah.
As a buyer, what I always do is I advise buyers, look, if you can trust the seller, obviously, because sometimes you get in situations where the seller's trying to do the cheapest work, and that's not necessarily true on radon because radon's pretty consistent between $1,500 and $2,200 to fix because that's what the companies seem to charge. But if you can trust the seller, make them repair it, and then you send somebody back to inspect it later to make sure it was done correctly. Because I've had instances where people have said, "Oh, I'll take a credit." And then they open up whatever it is, and they find out that what they thought was a $2,500 job is a $6,000 job, and the seller's already gone, and you're out the window, and it's a bad situation. So, like you're saying, it does depend on which side of the table you're on. Like when you were on the seller side, I'm assuming, or the buyer side.
We were buying.
Oh, we were buying.
Yeah.
So radon tends to be a little bit easier to deal with because it's more confined as to actual costs. So you probably didn't take much risk there.
No, and it got put in pretty much right away. The thing of it was that where we live is all sand, and so it's not a lot of rocks at all in where we live. And the guy who built our house, I was having a conversation with him at one point, and he goes, "You have a radon system?" He goes, "That's so weird." He goes, "In our development," he goes, there were never any issues. So it was one of those things where you kind of scratch your head about that and go, well, did we really need one? I don't know. But, we ended up having to put one in based on what was found during the inspection.
Sure.
So, do you know what time it is? It's community spotlight time.
It's a trick question.
This is a portion of our show where we like to highlight businesses that we like to work with. And one of those businesses that we're going to highlight today is LH LaPlante Company up in Plattsburgh, New York. Andy LaPlante, can't say enough about him and his crew up there. They do commercial and industrial HVAC, plumbing, mechanical contracting. They do a lot in prisons. They do a lot in different state-run and federal-run facilities. But they can handle the large jobs as well. They can handle big, huge complexes and new building constructions going in. They've been doing it since 1986. Just phenomenal guys up there. A good team up there. LH LaPlante and Company, P.O. Box 496, and that's 52 Main Mill Street, Plattsburgh, New York, 12901. If you want to reach out to them, you can reach them at 518-561-8003 or info@laplante.com. So, lhlaplant.com. So, check them out if you're in the market for industrial HVAC, plumbing needs, and stuff like that. Great company to work with. They work all over upstate New York, so good company to highlight there. So, moving on to the second part, I think one of the things that sometimes people don't understand in the real estate process, right, is you go and you are trying to find a home. And sometimes it's beneficial if you have a buyer's agent versus an agent that's on acting as a dual agent capacity, right? A lot of times you'll go in and it might be the listing agent that you're talking to. Can you speak a little bit why it's important to have the buyer agent representing you, and then also your attorney backing you up as well?
That's a very confusing point, because I'm also a mortgage real estate broker, and I'm not actively doing it, but I did it for a number of years. And people don't understand this. There's like 3 different levels of representation. I mean, you can have a listing agent, you can have a seller's agent, you can have someone who's representing a dual agency, and then you can have a buyer's. So a lot of times when you go without a realtor, you think that seller's realtor is representing you automatically. You just look at it and say, oh, they're a realtor, they're being friendly, they have an obligation to protect me, they have an obligation. But when you look through the documents, which nobody ever looks through the documents when they sign those agency disclosure forms that are part of the initial package when you get a binder or a contract, it says, I'm representing the seller, I don't represent you. The majority of the times, because realtors don't want to be liable to serving 2 masters, so to speak. So they turn around and they say, I'm only representing the seller, but the buyer thinks that they're actually helping them. Right. And that's not only the case. I mean, there's a lot of good realtors out there who would help them regardless, but they're not obligated in the same respect as they would be for a buyer. So
right, because there's one commission that's split out between
different agents. We could go through that. Yeah.
Right. So, if you have a separate buyer's agent, they're there to represent you to make money. Right? They want the transaction to go through, but they also want to do what's in your best interest. The selling agent wants to do what's in the best interest of the seller, right? They want to get a higher price, right? Because the commission's based off of the final price of the contract.
I think you have somebody, from what you were saying, coming up as an agent at some point in the future, but one of the things that people kind of have a misconception on is like, I get an agent, it's going to cost me money. Now, as a buyer, it's not going to cost you any money because, like my brother said, you split the commission. So when someone goes to a realtor and says, I want to list my house, and they sign documents to list their house, an agreement, they agree on whatever the commission structure is, 5, 6, 7, whatever.
So a buyer can have that representation
for free,
and that professionalized, that expertise, that opinion, right, for no cost to them, because the buyer's getting paid off of, correct me if I'm wrong, the listing price of the house through the seller's agency.
Correct, yeah. The seller pays for one set commission, and how his agent, seller side, splits that commission depends on whether or not there's a co-broke, they call it. And the co-broke would be a purchaser's agent walking in saying, I brought the buyer, you have the seller, and the buyer basically piggybacks on the seller's commission to be able to get a representative there, to be able to answer questions, to coordinate things like coordinate the inspection, coordinate the appraisal that comes out for your mortgage if you're getting a mortgage, do the final walkthrough, maybe answer questions, maybe let somebody in that needs to give an estimate or something like that. So really there's no risk for a buyer to go out and grab that person. But a lot of people think, like, if I go get a buyer's agent or I have a realtor, I'm going to have to pay something. That's simply not the case. Some realtors, just to digress for a second, some realtors could charge a separate fee, but that's generally not the case. There's a form that they have that they could literally lock you into paying them a fee, but that's generally not the case. Like 99.9% of the times, the realtors are just looking to assist one side or the other, and they come and they just basically show up and do their tasks or duties, whatever you want to call it, and then collect a check at the end.
Right.
Another question that people have too is, where's the attorney in that process with the bank? You know what I mean? Sometimes banks have representation of their legal side, obviously, because they're the one loaning a massive amount of money to an individual, right? And then the individuals, either buyer or seller, work with an attorney to represent their interests. How does that, kind of, I guess you would say, shorten the process when you're knowledgeable of the system and expect what other attorneys are going to ask for?
Well, yeah, I mean, you basically get in situations where you deal with the same attorneys over and over and over again, that when you write a contract, you know what you're going to get back in the context of a ride or adding terms.
That's important for listeners to understand that. why you want to work with an attorney that does a lot of house closings, and not necessarily, you don't want to go necessarily to an attorney that does a one-off house closing here or there. Right? Is that relationship between attorneys is key in the timely manner and process that things get done on that closing, which, like you said, could stretch out for months and be frustrating, especially if you have to move in a time frame.
Correct.
If you're moving from Denver here, you know what I mean, and you're buying that property contingent upon you being able to live here for your new employer, it's important that they have that relationship built in.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can tell when you get a file and an attorney does a closing once in a blue moon versus the regular attorneys. Even if they're outside the area and I'm not used to dealing with them or something similar, I can tell right away, like, you've only done one closing every year probably, and you don't have any idea what you're looking for or what you think you should have, so you're just kind of muddling along. And that does delay the process because it doesn't give his clients a sounding board to answer questions, because he's probably very involved in other areas of the law, and the closing probably goes very down on the list for importance.
This could be something that's really when you're talking to your team member and your expert in your as a client or a listener in your whatever it is you're doing, you want to make sure that you've got somebody who is targeted in on what it is your needs are. It's a huge difference.
So we relate to a medical practice all the time, right? Your shoulder's hurting, you're not going to go to a foot doctor.
Right.
Exactly. What I mean? You're going to go to a specialist in that area. Same thing in the legal world. Yep. You're not hopefully going to go to an attorney that does, like you said, one house closing a year or one since they've been barred, which might be 20 years ago.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or and the one that they did was for their grandparent or their
for their relative.
Or their relative. Yeah. Not that you do any things for relatives usually, but on a side note.
But it's the same thing even with when people want a financial advisor, but really they just want someone that's going to buy and sell stocks for them, as opposed to someone who's going to do a full financial plan. That's can be the same person, but often it's not. Often it's a different divide of our own field that we're in.
Yeah, and I could see how that would be a big problem, and it does become a problem in the context of real estate law as well. It just you can't have a attorney or any professional that doesn't really know the ins and outs of it, and you have to have a little bit more knowledge than just I picked up a book and did one closing this year and then I do one next year.
What are some of the things that you see kicked back from the bank that the bank is requiring, aside from the inspection and the title and making sure that the property is suitable? Anything else major that you see kicked back from the bank that's a common, thing that maybe could be avoided?
Well, I mean, just have all your docs in a row, meaning like if they're going to want some bank statements, most likely have some bank statements for the last couple months, like readily available. Tax returns, they always want these tax returns. The joke is basically, a lot of times lenders will ask for things 3 or 4 times for some reason. I don't know if it gets passed up the food chain and then somebody else wants to ask for the same documents. So that's a common frustration with borrowers, is like, I've given them the stuff 3 or 4 times now. I don't understand why I keep having to give it. But have it handy, because odds are if you give it once, you have to give it again. And that will save a tremendous amount of time, because just the lists that you get from periodic from time to time, you're going to have to keep fulfilling those lists to keep the process moving. If you don't get the docs in, they won't go to the next stage, and then that will delay it a little bit more. And then how that kind of plays into your contract is your contract has a date. It's called a mortgage contingency, and it says to the seller, you have so many weeks to obtain a mortgage commitment, which is the bank's guarantee, or sorry to say that word, but the bank's offer to you to give you the loan through a certain period of time.
Right.
And if you can't achieve it by then, you can cancel, and then you can turn around and say, well, I didn't meet my commitment date, therefore I get my deposit back. But things that the bank would point out, I mean, if you see a leak, if they see a stain in the ceiling on an appraisal, you're going to get it pointed out. So like I tell my sellers, do you have any stains on your ceiling that even if they're old, you better bin them or something, because if they see it, they're going to flag it. And then what does the bank think? The bank thinks there's a leak. Right. And getting them to move off of that position is nearly like takes a massive amount of work. Like I had a client, I don't know if I can go into this, but I had a client who the seller wasn't paying attention. He was doing a flip. So the water had 3 or 4 inches of, the basement had 3 or 4 inches of water in it. Well, nobody's paying attention, so they send the appraiser out, and he takes a picture of the basement, and you can see 3 or 4 inches of water.
Wow.
Well, just to get that off the bank's radar without her having to like hold a bunch of money aside at the time of closing was like moving a mountain. It was like you had to get an engineer, and then the engineer didn't want to say that he knew exactly why the water was there. So things like that will pop up. I mean, definitely the one that I see the most is the stain in the ceiling.
Yeah, and just so listeners can understand the process, right? It's not the person at the bank. It's not that person that you meet at the teller or the person in the department. It's the internal underwriter, right? The person that's underwriting that mortgage, and the underwriters are there. They're basically there to protect the bank, right? So they're looking at all the detail, and they're saying, oh wow, is there a risk here? Is there a risk that this property is going to go down in value? Person's going to move out, going to default on their mortgage, and we're going to be stuck with a property that we have to pump $100,000 into to get back on the market or something along that lines. And I know from dealing, at least with sending out the financial statements, is the underwriter wants as much detail as possible. So a lot of times clients will call us and say, hey, I need a statement of my accounts. Well, in addition to the statement of accounts, they want the details over the last couple of months. They want to show if your income's coming from a mutual fund investment or a certain account or your IRA or your Roth. They want to show the history of that, and they're doing a calculation to say how long until this account's depleted out, right? Because if you're drawing $5,000 off of a $15,000 account, the underwriter is going to put two and two together and say, all right, 3 months from now, this 15 grand is going to be gone. Where is that money coming from next? So that's where I find on our end, we get a lot of calls back because they want more detail. Hey, I saw this distribution comes out every March. What is it? Where is it coming from? It might be a required minimum distribution from an IRA for an older person. It might be just a systematic withdrawal that they take each year to help with their property taxes or whatever it might be. So you want to make sure as an advisor that you're providing the detail in a timely manner. And one thing I always try to do is as soon as a lender or an underwriter or somebody reaches out to me and says, hey, I need these documents, I want to get it over to them as fast as possible because I know that our process can slow that whole closing down. And most people don't realize that the financial advisor is involved in that a lot of times as well. Right? Because also we're in some cases showing a buyer how to effectively purchase that property by using their asset to fund the monthly payment. There's some creative ways using dividend accounts, municipal bonds, income annuities, things along that lines where we can structure a payment coming in to match the mortgage payment or a large part of it.
Yeah. Yep. And basically relieve that part of the stress of what happens if, something changes, the world gets turned upside down, where the payment's coming from.
Yeah, and on that side, communication is key, right? I mean, communication between the attorney or even the bank representative to clearly paint the picture of what we're doing with the finances so they understand. You would think that an underwriter could look at a financial statement and say, oh, they have $1 million in assets and not have a problem with where $1,000 a month's coming from. But, I guess simple math isn't always their strong suit. They want to know, hey, is that $1 million going to be able to support this $1,000 a month? Common sense would say, yeah, most likely, right? But in reality, they want to know it. They want to see it on paper. They want to see that. So, want to go into one other topic before we close out the show, and that's just kind of maybe some of the nuances that people, I guess, misunderstand when a property is in an irrevocable trust. Because I get a lot of questions on, hey, if I move my real estate in an irrevocable trust, can I sell it? I don't think I can sell it. Can I buy a new property? Can I get a condo? You want to speak a little bit about the difference between property outside of an irrevocable and inside an irrevocable?
Sure. Well, just to digress from there, if you have 5 seconds, I mean, generally, an irrevocable means that you cannot readily access those assets. Usually they're structured in such a way that you can get income out of whatever the asset in the irrevocable trust is generating, and that can come out on whatever quarterly basis or whatever you need. So it does require some planning before you jump into an irrevocable trust. You can hold real estate in an irrevocable trust. That trust can negotiate or transfer assets as though it was any other type of trust, meaning like if you had 5 shares of IBM stock or something similar and you were in an irrevocable trust with it and you wanted to buy 5 shares of Microsoft, you could sell the IBM and buy Microsoft. You could do the same with the house. The house is the same premise. So the trust.
So what you're saying is the trust is its own person. It's its own tax ID number.
In the context of the irrevocable, yes. An irrevocable trust has its own employer identification number, tax ID number, whatever you want to call it. It may have a separate return for that income that's being generated by the trust as well, independent of whatever you're doing. A revocable, you can use your social security number and it kind of reports underneath your same taxes and things like that. But the irrevocable is kind of taking it to the next stage. Reasons why you would use an irrevocable, I don't know if you want to go down that road, but you would use an irrevocable for sometimes estate planning, because by moving assets far enough in advance of a person passing, some of those assets can be excluded from your overall estate totals. You can also use the irrevocable for potentially Medicaid or elder law planning, which I happen to do a lot of. So I have that conversation like 4 or 5 times a week with senior clients who are looking at protecting assets in case they turn around and heaven forbid, have to go into some sort of nursing facility, and the nursing facility is knocking on the door saying, are you going to write a check every month for $14,000 or $15,000, or can you qualify for long-term care Medicaid? And that would be a valid use for an irrevocable as well. And that's what I see. The majority of times I see an irrevocable used for long-term care Medicaid planning, just to avoid those loss of assets if they should get sick and have to go into a facility.
So for the house, when they sell the house in trust, it's the trustees, right, signing off on it.
The trustee or trustees.
And then sometimes not immediately are they buying a new home, or do they ever buy a home with those assets. They just need to, on our end, need to be registered in trust format. So, it could be a mutual fund investment, could be another investment. The registration on your account is the, Jim and John Smith Irrevocable Family Trust, so that assets never leave the trust. And then when they go to buy the new home,
the trust buys it.
Same thing, right? The trust is buying it. So that technically that asset, house to cash, back to house, never has left the trust process.
Yeah, and one of the most important things that I find all the time, like literally like when people are talking about throwing a house into an irrevocable trust, the biggest concern is a lot of times they're older, they don't have kids obviously in the house, they're looking at downsizing. And like you said at the beginning, the house is usually like one of your bigger assets potentially. So a lot of people are looking to buy something smaller and then maybe bank some of the money that comes from that sale to be able to continue to live whatever lifestyle they want. When you do that to an irrevocable, you have to be careful, because you can't say, well, I have a $400,000 house and I sold $400,000, I'm going to go in and buy a $200,000 condo in Miami Beach or wherever you want to go, and I'm going to live off the other two, because you can't get that out of the irrevocable. So that's one of the nuances that I butt up against all the time. And you kind of have to explain that to the client and say, look, you be aware that if you plan on living off some of the equity from the sale of your house, it's going to be a problem for you if you put it into an irrevocable trust.
Excellent. All good points.
Yeah. Yep.
So, in recapping before we get into just a couple minute-by-minute stuff, so, obviously you want to work with an attorney that is well-versed in real estate law, in the transaction process, the closings itself. You want to make sure that you have a buyer's agent, if you're a buyer, separate, right? My takeaway is that it doesn't cost you anything to have that representation. Right. And you want to make sure that you have an attorney that actually has good relationships in that real estate world, whether it's with a bank, whether it's with inspection, people, whether it's, across the board. You want to make sure that person has those ties that can expedite the process. So, Mike, you want to tell them how they can reach you?
Sure. They can call me at 518-622-9910, or my law firm's email address is esslie@yahoo.com.
Excellent. And they're located on Main Street in Cary, New York, but do business in all the surrounding counties as well. So it's a pleasure having you on today. And let's get into something just a little we call minute by minute. And let's start with, I guess, a topic that's near and dear to your heart, and that's soccer. Sure. So you want to update us on maybe the semi-pro women's league that you guys are starting down in Ulster County?
Yep. Well, my daughter Hannah is really into soccer. She's playing at Buff State in the fall. And she basically owns a USW League 2 team that's centered in the Mid-Hudson Valley region. Last year was their inaugural season, and this is their second season. She's been processing that completely by herself. She hired a coach, do tryouts, the whole thing, interaction. That's been going well. We were just in Miami last week, actually, at a Soccer X convention, which was like an international convention of all the who's who of soccer, and she ended up getting invited as a team owner, so that was kind of cool to see some of the people that we would recognize as being soccer people.
How old is she?
She's 17.
17 and started this. That's fantastic.
Your kids play soccer?
Yeah, my youngest does.
Oh,
yep.
Soccer's a great sport because you can literally, it's very cheap to get into in the sense of like equipment wise. It's not like hockey where you have to pay like $1 million for things.
Cleats and a ball.
Cleats and a ball. But the nice thing at the younger age groups is that they just have to run around and kick the ball. I mean, so there's not a lot of expectations of what's going on. So it's a good way to build into it, and then when you get more serious, you get into all these clubs up here, and then it can get a little costly.
Yep.
Well, then the travel is
Travel
games
like
could be.
immense.
That's with any sport.
Yep.
Yeah, soccer's a good sport.
Unless ping pong, I don't know ping pong travel.
Maybe, I don't know.
You're the ping pong pro. I'd have to ask you on that.
The ping pong league.
So, well, thank you so much for coming in today. We appreciate it. And as always, for our listeners, you can find us at yourtimeyourmoney.net, and that's net for your net worth, or at Esslie Group at saterinvestors.com. Please check us out, subscribe on YouTube, and also we can find us on Spotify and Google Play as well. So thank you so much for coming in today, and we hope you found value to it. Your time,
your money.